Well, Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting is with us now. I can't even begin to imagine how these parents must be. And there was a culture of telling them that there was nothing that could have been done and they had to go home and potentially try to get pregnant again. When are we going to stop this?
Well, I really hope that today's report marks a turning point and delivers some justice for families who had to campaign to get the Ockenden review in the first place, which I think they should never have been put in that position. When we've been talking to Donna Ockenden and her team, we're not expecting Donna to pull her punches with today's report. So, as you say, Kate, I can't imagine what these mothers have gone through, but I hope that at the end of this journey of campaigning for justice that they feel a sense of vindication and also assurance that this isn't going to happen to women in the future, because I think on top of everything else they've experienced, the only real comfort we can provide to these families now is to say that the truth has come out, lessons will genuinely be learned, and there'll be a turning point.
So what guidance is she giving you?
Well, so I haven't seen the recommendations. In fact, I think she's going to be setting these things out as must-dos, not recommendations. I think she's going to be insisting that politicians right across the political divide act. It's my expectation the Health Secretary will accept the findings in full and we will hold him to it. But I hope this will be a moment of consensus in the House of Commons. They've got plenty of other arguments going on health today, but I hope there will be some consensus on this. The thing that does worry me about maternity in particular is we know that there's a shortage of NHS staff right across the board, but it's particularly acute in maternity services. And even last year we had hundreds of cases where women were turned away from maternity units because there weren't staff there to receive them. So this report does look at historic failures dating back 20 years and across successive governments, and I want to acknowledge that as a Labour politician. This is not just about the current governments, it's successive governments. But there are real challenges today too, and I think we've got to face up to those so that every expectant mother in this country can have the confidence and certainty of knowing that when she gives birth, she'll be in safe hands.
As you point out, historically the Labour government was not without guilt, and we saw what happened with the Mid-Staffordshire scandal. And it all comes down to the fact that parents and patients are complaining and politicians are not listening to them. Do you accept that politicians in the past have not always listened to people when they've had heartfelt concerns?
Yeah, and it's not just politicians. I think the NHS has to learn lessons as well. Some of the testimony we've been hearing from grieving mums this morning about their experiences of asking questions, raising concerns, asking for caesarean sections, being denied. I think there's a lesson here about listening to patients. Of course, when we put ourselves in the hands of clinicians, we respect their clinical expertise and their judgment, but we also know our own bodies. And I think sometimes the NHS isn't always good at listening to patients in the way that needs to happen. So I think there's a cultural change that's needed, as well as the investment in the staff, the equipment, the technology that the NHS needs to provide high quality and accessible services, not just on maternity, but right across the board where there are real challenges in the NHS right now.
And given that you've spoken to the report's author, how confident are you that what happened in Shrewsbury would never happen again?
Well, if we listen and if we act, I think we will be as confident as we can be. And I think that's the responsibility on the government today. It will be a cross-party responsibility as well. And I can commit to those recommendations, those must-dos, as I'm sure Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary, will be holding him to account as the opposition, but we'll also be taking it on board in terms of our own plans, for the next general election where we hope Labour will be in government.
From Friday, will you be testing if you've got COVID symptoms?
Yeah, I think people should, and to be honest...
What if they can't afford to?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it, Kay? I think what's effectively happening now is a stealth tax. It's a COVID tax on people doing the right things. I'm glad that finally the government's seen sense and said that NHS staff will get access to free testing.
Some of them.
But what about families that will struggle to pay for the test? What about those people that are going regularly into care homes to see their parents or grandparents and will want to do the right thing before going in? We've got rising bills. We know the cost of living is a big issue, and we've got a big tax rise coming in April too, which will hit families. So on top of this, to add an additional cost, whilst lecturing the public on personal responsibility when it comes to COVID, which in itself is laughable given the actions of the Prime Minister, we've got to make sure that people can afford to do the right thing. And that's why I think it's the wrong decision at the wrong time to take away access to free testing now.
You've been reading my notes, haven't you? Because I was going to go on to ask you about what happened as far as Partygate is concerned. We've had the first tranche of fines, 20 separate fines, don't know how many people, but 20 separate fines have been issued. People were breaking the law at the heart of Downing Street when the rest of the country were in lockdown. What does that say about the culture of Downing Street?
Well, it says the Prime Minister's a liar because he told the House of Commons repeatedly that there were no parties and no wrongdoing, no law breaking, no rule breaking. Number 10.
He says that he wasn't aware of.
Well, he was there. I mean, that's what I think is so completely untenable about Boris Johnson's position as Prime Minister now. I can't think of a single Prime Minister that has walked into the House of Commons and deliberately lied. There may be times when Prime Ministers have been wrong. There may be times where Prime Ministers might bend the truth or stretch the truth, and every week at Prime Minister's Questions, successive Prime Ministers have been guilty of answering different questions to the one that's asked. These are the tricks of the politician's trade, because sometimes the truth can be uncomfortable when presented with difficult questions. You've seen that. But to have a Prime Minister lie to the country, to the House of Commons, to the Queen, and still be in post is completely unacceptable.
What should happen to Rishi Sunak if he receives a fixed penalty notice?
Well, I think it's the same rule applies to everyone. His position would also be untenable. And it's amazing how invisible the Chancellor has been over the Partygate allegations. He lives next door. I think he should be really upfront now himself about whether or not he's been involved in any wrongdoing and upfront with the country. And I hope that in the case of all government ministers, we will be able to return to a position where we can take them at their word. When they categorically tell us something is not true, we can believe them. But how can we when we've got a Prime Minister at the top who has knowingly lied, where Conservative MPs are tolerating this? And I think we've got to a point now where I suspect Boris Johnson will lead the Conservative Party into the next election because Tory MPs have made themselves complicit in his lying. And ultimately, it's now up to the voters to ask themselves a question. Are you, the public, comfortable and tolerant of a situation where the Prime Minister can knowingly tell barefaced lies to you, the British people? And if you're not happy with this, you've got an opportunity in May at the local elections to send Boris Johnson packing, and you'll have an opportunity at the next general election to send the Prime Minister packing too.
Final thought, just before I let you go, read on the front page of yesterday's Telegraph that men who go for scans in hospital are now going to be asked whether they are pregnant. Is that appropriate use of NHS funds?
I don't know about funds. I do think we need a bit of common sense, tolerance and reason in this debate about trans people and gender identity. And I think, particularly in terms of clinical settings, the NHS has tried and tested guidelines on how to deal with people respectfully. When I went in for my kidney scans last year, I did not need to be asked whether I was pregnant, evidently not. If someone is going in who has undergone gender reassignment, or is going through the process of transitioning, maybe presents in a different gender to the sex they were born into, then maybe those questions are appropriate. But we've got to take things on a case-by-case basis, apply some common sense, and in terms of the more general debate about trans rights and inclusion, the tension that exists between sex-based rights and gender identity, which we're seeing playing out on our television screens on programmes like yours, let's just have a bit more calm, common sense, decency and respect in this debate. And I must say, just speaking for myself, I've kind of been pulling my hair out at some of the gotcha questions on TV programmes and radio programmes recently, and the extent to which we're kind of tying ourselves up in knots on the wrong sorts of issues on this. We have a small but significant number of people in this country who do not feel that they are in the right gender, they're born into the wrong sex. And I can't imagine what that's like. I know from talking to people it's unbearably difficult, and we've got to treat those people with respect. There are also lots of women who, when it comes to single-sex spaces, are worried and afraid. And there are cases sometimes where they've got good reason to be afraid, and there have been some horrific cases we've seen in the media recently, whether in the NHS or in prisons. So we've got to acknowledge that and address it, not try and silence it or stifle it, but find a way through and a compromise through in the way that we have done before on sexual orientation, for example, equal marriage. We got to a compromise that maybe not everyone loved, but everyone could live with. And we did that by listening, reasonable, respectful debate and finding a way through. And I think that's the answer on trans rights and inclusion.
OK, we're out of time. How's your health now? Are you better?
100% recovered. I'm very, very pleased to say and very relieved too. Thank you very much.
We are pleased to see you as well. Thrilled to see you. Thanks
a lot
indeed for joining us. Much appreciated.